You began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again, and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill, and I am the researcher, the writer, producer, editor, all of the things. And this podcast is where I cover all things true crime, not just serial killers, and that's perfectly okay. I've been at this for a great many years. So if you're into the entire story of these dangerous people, including childhood experiences and possible genetically inherited issues, the psychology of it all, the nature versus nurture debate, well, then you've come to the right place, because that's what I do here. If you are anything like me, of course you want to know the hows and the whys of true crime. Now, if you are into murder and mayhem with some stories of the animal uprising and the occasional rack report, well, check out my second podcast, Serial Killing, Murder in the News. It's pretty slapstick. It can be kind of funny. It can be serious. We go through all of the emotions over there. If you enjoy my content, consider supporting my content. The more support, the more content. So today's podcast will be on serial killer John Joubert. I try to warn you guys when it involves children, and this one most certainly does. So there's my disclaimer. So we're getting into it. John Joseph Joubert IV was born on July 2nd, 1963 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, making him a Cancer. So as we sometimes do, as long as they weren't born in the 40s, because we've been through that a plethora of times, let's see what was going on in the world at the time of his birth. The external environment and stress levels of the mother, all of that can play a role, have an influence in the overall story. That's why we go over it. And boy, did some big things happen, right, in 1963. This is the year that the BBC show Doctor Who premiered. This is also the year that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. We had our first push-button telephones this year. The hula hoop was created and sold. John Pope the 23rd died this year, and Beatlemania was sweeping across the UK. The 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, which was a big catalyst in spurring on the civil rights movement. The famous painting, the Mona Lisa, was first displayed in the United States this year. Julia Child's cooking show also premiered this year, and this was the year that the Alcatraz prison shut its doors. So some pretty big things going on in the world. John's parents were John Joseph Joubert III and Beverly, when I could not find her maiden name. John's father, John III, went by Jack and was born in April of 1942 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He was a sports kid. He was a very passionate fan of the Patriots football team and MLB's the Red Sox. Our John's grandfather was John Jr., of course, who married a woman named Alice Wood. And that is as far back as I could find in the time that I had for research. But there didn't seem to be anything important enough to be noteworthy, not way back in the family history. The only thing I found was that a neighbor who had grown up across the street from the Joubert family when our John was coming up said that they had good memories of the family that lived there. But behind closed doors, right? We're getting there. So John's father, John III, and John's mother, Beverly, ran sort of this family restaurant together, and his father worked as both a cook and a waiter. And from the beginning, it was obvious that baby John was special. By the age of 3, he was already beginning to learn to read. His baby sister had been born when he was 2. So by the time John was 5 years old, it was said that he was checking out library books by himself. I mean, that is impressive, to say the least. His IQ was later tested at 123, which is considered pretty high. His parents enrolled him in a private Catholic elementary school, so we can reasonably assume that the family, and at least I know his mother, were deeply religious. And along with the religious upbringing, he also served as an altar boy. Now, it was said that John was physically on the smaller side compared to his peers all of his childhood, and he was bullied because of it. And apparently, he didn't even stand up for himself against his bullies. He just took the abuse. A friend from early elementary said that John was again smart, but also very shy. Now, again, Beverly, his mom, would later tell John that when he was 4 years old, he witnessed his own father attempt to strangle her until she inevitably passed out. But John maintained he had no memory of this happening. Since it was in the source material and then later on, John was interviewed, that is on YouTube if you want to see it. He talked about his mother telling him that, so I thought that it would be at least share worthy, right? I mean, he blocked it out if it happened. But what he did remember was that his father would come home drunk. There was a lot of strife and fighting in the home, which would keep him in a perpetual state of stress, which we know is horrible for children. And he retreated into his imagination to distract himself from that very stress. I did that very thing, very detailed. So, though I didn't read anything about his father's disciplinary actions towards the children, John and his sister, I did read that Beverly spanked her kids until they were nearly teens. Now, everyone has an opinion on spanking. It's a hotly debated topic, which I'm not going to get in the middle of, but I'm just trying to say that we don't know how bad his spankings were, okay? And it was also said that she belittled their father in front of them as well. So he had to grow up hearing his mother talk shit about his dad constantly. And then when he was 6 years old, his parents finally divorced. He and his younger sister stayed with their mother, of course, that was customary for the time. Beverly was described as very domineering and, for whatever reason, would not allow the children to see or spend any time with their father. And this would be a really big turning point in John's young life. It was nearly immediately after this big life change that John began fantasizing about harming others and having ultimate control. He was 6 years old. That's pretty early for that. That generally doesn't start till 8, 9, 10. That's concerning. So he began sort of daydreaming about killing and even consuming the babysitter that lived across the street from them. Not because she had wronged him in any way. It was just because she was simply there. Quote, I would think these thoughts, and that would relieve the tension, John would later say. I have learned that it made me feel better, and as I grew up, it became a habit. End quote. So at 8 years old, his mother moved him and his 6-year-old sister out of the family home, all of the uprooting that we've talked about a lot, and into what was described as, quote, unkempt and dilapidated apartment or small house in Portland, Maine. Beverly had thought that this would be a fresh start for herself and the children, but John was really upset that he was unable to see his father. One source stated that he rode his bike clear back down to Massachusetts to see his father, which I found really hard to believe that he would be able to ride his bike that far. So, of course, I Googled that shit, and it said it's only an hour-and-a-half drive. So, I don't know. There is that. But once settled, Beverly earned money by working as a bookkeeper. It was said that his parents continued to argue back and forth about which parent John should live with, and I would surmise that's because John told his mother on repeat that he wanted to live with his father, but it was no use. His mother would not allow it. Only now that his father was no longer in the picture, his mother's belittling moved from his dad onto him. And with a move means having to start all over at a new school, and John was already small and kind of out of sorts, stood out. John was immediately a social outcast at the new school. He was still smaller than the other boys, and he was quite thin. His last name was the subject of peer ridicule. They called him Jujubee, according to one of his teachers. This was around the age of 11. There were a couple of kids that were friendly with him, but it was said that his mother was outspokenly against him having friends, finding fault with any and all of them. At age 12, John started delivering newspapers in his neighborhood for some pocket money. And remember that, delivering newspapers as a 12-year-old. Just put a pin in that. This would actually be his job until he was 17 years old. But also at 12 years old, John realized that he was attracted to other boys, which was a distressing revelation for him at the time. And then at the age of 13, he would begin a series of his first violent acts. Junior high and then getting into high school, his constant tormentors called him little boy, and another teacher later stated that he never fought back or tried to argue. He simply took it, and it gave her the impression that perhaps, maybe on some level, John felt as if he deserved that kind of treatment. But as we can expect, he began to withdraw and isolate himself even more, living further into the fantasies in his mind, more detailed. To try to distract himself, he joined the Boy Scouts, and he went up the ranks really fast. He was impressive. He even played the clarinet in the high school band. He even tried his hand at being on the track team, but none of that could keep him from imagining murdering complete strangers on the streets, or of restraining and gagging those who tried to resist him. So, according to Murderpedia, at 13 years old, John was riding his bike when he spotted 6-year-old Sarah Canty bending down to pick up a football that she had dropped. She was just 6. As she bent down to pick the ball up, he rode behind her and he stabbed her in the back with a pencil. Then he quickly rode off, according to police reports. Crying in pain, little Sarah ran inside of her house. Underneath her jacket, her shirt, and her undershirt was a 1/4-inch puncture wound. Another source said that he had used a screwdriver. Either way, that's horrible. Then a few weeks later, and out walking, he spotted another young woman who was walking and on her way to her college class. He walked up beside her, and she said hi to him. He then grabbed her, covering her mouth with one hand as she felt what she thought was a punch in her side. When he let her go, she cried out, "Why did you do that?" John ran off just as she realized that she was bleeding. He had, in fact, stabbed her, and she had to have emergency kidney surgery that kept her recovering in the hospital for a solid week. 2 months after that, in March, 9-year-old third grader Michael Witham was walking along the street when John, on his bicycle, beckoned the boy to come closer. He asked the little boy where he was going. When Michael looked away for just a moment, John slashed his throat with an X-Acto knife. Michael ran home bleeding, and it was said that it took 12 stitches to close that wound. And John continued these random attacks until he was 17, and once he nearly strangled another young boy to death. And for all of these attacks, he was never caught. In the spring of 1981, he graduated from Cheverus High School, which is again a private Catholic secondary school, all boys, no girls. He had honors. He excelled in English and in history. His Spanish teacher said he did very well. And that, my friends, was John's childhood. So let's dive in and analyze. Now, I don't know how confident I am in this information, but I did read that John's mother told him that he had, again, 4 years old, witnessed his father strangle his mother until she lost consciousness. Again, he says he does not remember it, but one of his own victims in his youth, well, he nearly strangled that boy to the point of death. There's something to be said there, I think. Kids repeat what they see and hear. We all know that. But we do know that there was fighting between his parents in the home, with his mother being described as domineering. The parents divorced, and he desperately wanted to get away from his mother and go live with his father. It very much reminds me of a young Edmund Kemper in that sense, right? Domineering mothers do some serious damage to their boys. A domineering mother can have actually significant and lasting negative impacts on her children, especially their sons, affecting their emotional development, relationships, and their own sense of self. These effects can include difficulty with independence, low self-esteem, anxiety, and issues with forming healthy relationships. The son may also struggle with resentment, guilt, or develop narcissistic tendencies. I read that she didn't like any of the friends that he tried to make, and he never dated. He never had a love interest at all. In some cases, overly controlling and domineering mothers can create issues with sexual confidence and initiative in their son, sexual initiative. You can think Ed Gein in this sense as well. That's a great example. And then we have the controlling nature of these mothers that, in turn, make their sons internalize their mother's sort of controlling behaviors, potentially repeating those patterns in their own relationships. It's about the control. I think we can see that this is an issue for John, and having that control, that domination over his initial victims gave him quite the dopamine rush. And while he wasn't known to act out at school or cause problems at home, I was leaning towards conduct disorder. Due to the bullying and his mother's treatment of him, he withdrew into his mind and into his own little fantasy world that became ever increasingly dark and twisted and disturbing. And we have heard that story many times if you've been following me for any time at all. I mean, Ed Kemper, Gein, Jerry Brudos, the list goes on and on. And as I've also said many times, there has been some evidence in that this aggressive and controlling behavior can reside on a specific gene mutation, sometimes called the warrior gene, and it is only inherited on the X chromosome, which is why we have so many more dangerous men. Again, I've talked about this a lot. Daughters get an X from the mom and an X from the dad, so dad dilutes it. But sons get the one X from the mother, the megadose, if you will. So, John's bottled up. He's isolating, bullied outside the home, controlled and belittled and bullied inside the home. He came to the realization that he was gay during a time when it was still somewhat dangerous to come out as such. And he was already being physically violent with others from the tender age of 13. What I didn't find was any evidence of animal torture or fire setting or him bullying other kids, so I'm not seeing like the full clinical conduct disorder here, but the ingredients were certainly there, right? Okay, so let's jump back into the story. So after graduating high school, he tried his hand at college, and though he wasn't really successful, he did manage to make a couple of first friends that he'd ever really had. He tried his hand at drinking and smoking some weed, right? But later he said he didn't like the sense of loss of control, which makes sense. So that next summer, he was having a hard time finding work. He became pretty frustrated. This would be when he would commit his first murder. So on August 22nd, 1982, 11-year-old Ricky Stetson decided to go for a jog on a pretty isolated road in Portland, Maine. When Ricky wasn't home by dark, his parents called the police. And as people were interviewed, witnesses would tell police that they saw the boy running and that there was a young man riding a bike beside him. Unfortunately, the next day, someone driving on the road saw the boy's body dumped on the side of the road. Whoever attacked the young boy tried to undress him, but then ultimately stabbed him in the chest, strangled him, and bit him on his lower leg. There was a suspect that was actually arrested for this murder, but his teeth did not match the bite marks on Ricky's body, or the bite mark. So he was released, albeit after 1.5 years in custody. No additional leads presented themselves in the case until January of 1984. Again, we'll get to that. Just within, I'm talking a very short time, John joined the Air Force, finished basic training, and was stationed and being trained as a radar technician in Bellevue, Nebraska. And it was during this time that he made his first real bestie, if you will, and he cherished this friendship so completely that it kept his murderous impulses at bay. He was also indulging in reading True Detective magazines and was kind of getting off on the pictures of these terrified women. But most importantly, and this is crazy, he started setting his alarm for 6:30 a.m. every morning, waking up just to decide whether or not he would go and look for a victim. Most mornings, he shut the alarm off and he just went back to sleep. So the next year, in 1983, the now 20-year-old John would suffer a devastating loss. That is how it was described in all of the source material. The best friend he had made in the Air Force died. Now, I could not find out in the time I had to research how his friend died, but this seems to be the catalyst for John to lose what little control he had. It was said that he fell into a deep depression for a while before he would murder again. On September 18th, 1983, 13-year-old Danny Eberl was doing his morning paper route job. Remember, John used to have a paper route as well. John drove up beside him, stopped, and abducted the young boy. He had a car now. John immediately bound Danny's hands and feet. He put tape on his mouth, and once he was satisfied that he had total control over the boy, he drove him to a rural area just a few miles from the Air Force base that John was stationed at in, again, Bellevue, Nebraska. It was then that John stabbed Danny 11 times. His body was found 3 days later. Danny's older brother said that he remembered a man in a tan car following the brothers for a few days before Danny disappeared, meaning that John was stalking them. Now, Danny's body had been found in some overgrown grass off the side of a gravel road, but since this was considered a kidnapping, this immediately became a federal crime, and the FBI was contacted and brought in to help with the investigation. Some local pedophiles were interviewed, but ultimately they were all cleared. Plus, there were no injuries that suggested the attack was sexual in any way, no injuries to the body. 3 months later, in December of 1983, 12-year-old Christopher Walden was walking to school one morning when John drove up beside him and threatened him with a knife to get into his car. As with Danny, John bound Christopher so he couldn't fight. He then took him to a remote area not too far from the area where Danny was found, tried to get his clothes off again, and attempted to strangle him, but got frustrated and eventually stabbed Christopher several times in his back, killing him. He cut, guys, that little boy's throat so deeply that he nearly decapitated him. Christopher's body was found in a wooded area 3 days later. Bless. Then 1 month later, so now we're amping up. We're getting faster. Less cooling off period between. January of 1984, the now 21-year-old John noticed a young lady, who was a preschool teacher, by the way, really kind of eyeballing him, and he noticed that she was writing down his license plate number. Well, this obviously pissed him off. She was very local. She was very aware of the recent murders of the little boys. Sources differ just a bit, but the consensus is that, again, he was pissed, he stopped, and he threatened her, but she was able to get away from him and run. She immediately called the police. The police traced the car based on the plates and found that it had been rented by John Joubert, who was an enlisted radar technician from Offutt Air Force Base. His own car, which was a tan Chevrolet Nova sedan, was being repaired. Now, it didn't take a lot of investigation to link the rented car in his name and then see what kind of vehicle was registered to him, and boom, it was a match. They went directly to the apartment that he lived in on base. He had a roommate too, and they arrested him. They found rope in his apartment that matched the rope that he was using to tie the boys up. It was this very unique type of rope only made for the U.S. military. And as we know, the FBI had already become involved. And as they were talking about these murders, this case in Nebraska, and their headquarters were in Quantico, Virginia, as most of us know, right? Well, there just happened to be a police officer from none other than Portland, Maine, in Virginia, taking part in some extra training, and he heard about John. So he got to talking to the other FBI guys and told them that it reminded him of this unsolved murder case back home. So they compared the evidence, the notes, and they were able to match the bite marks to the boys in Nebraska. It was then believed that he had joined the military after murdering 11-year-old Richard to get the hell out of Dodge, as they say. John was interrogated, and he eventually admitted to the murders. He also admitted that after the murders, he would self-service, if you know what I mean, because murdering the young boys got him sexually aroused. But I did not find anything that said that he assaulted those boys in any manner at all, sexually, is what I mean. So soon after, they connected him to the attacks of the people before he ever began to murder as well. He originally pleaded not guilty, but he changed his plea to guilty. He had a few psychiatric evaluations, and keep in mind this was in the 80s, and the consensus was that he suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder and schizoid personality disorder with sadistic tendencies. I think everyone is familiar with OCD, but as a refresher, I'll give some information on schizoid, because schizoid and schizotypal are the two that I know what they are, but I get them mixed up sometimes. So schizoid personality disorder is in the family of the cluster A personality disorders, which are typically described as the, quote, odd and eccentric cluster. The other cluster A's are paranoid and schizotypal. And then just for a little bit of extra credit, cluster B involves dramatic or emotional behaviors, and cluster C includes anxious or fearful behaviors. So schizoid personality disorder is a condition where a person shows very little, if any, interest and ability to form relationships with other people. It's very hard for this person to express a full range of emotions. These people are seen as keeping to themselves or even flat out rejecting other people. They may not be interested in or even able to form close friendships or romantic relationships. Think Jeffrey Dahmer. And as far as sadistic tendencies, well, we all understand that concept. So after his trial, a panel of 3 judges sentenced him to death by the electric chair. After a few years in prison, he admitted that he still fantasized about death and murder, and was even caught drawing on tissue paper these fantasies of violence with boys. And he tried to appeal his death penalty judgment. I found the appeal online, but he was ultimately executed by electric chair in 1996 when he was just 33 years old. It was said that just before he was executed, he made a statement, quote, "I just want to say that again, I am sorry for what I have done. I do not know if my death will change anything or if it will bring anyone peace. And I just ask the families of Danny Eberl and Christopher Walden and Richard Stetson to please try to find some peace and ask the people of Nebraska to forgive me. That's all." End quote. His last meal consisted of pizza, by the way, if you were curious, with green peppers and onions. He also had strawberry cheesecake and just black coffee. The last meals are always interesting to find. Oh, and for an added little bit of gross, it was said that while he was being electrocuted, trigger warning, he rapidly developed this 4-inch blister on the top of his head and these little blisters on both sides of his head above his ears. So, what kind of serial killer was he labeled? He was labeled an organized lust killer because he had a very specific type of victim, which was prepubescent boys, and he had wrapped up in his mind and connected this sex and violence together. It's kind of like what Jeffrey Dahmer's dad talked about, the commingling of sex and violence in the mind. Too young. He would then pleasure himself after killing his victims. He was aroused by killing these boys. So physically, he was always small, full grown. He was 5'6" tall, or, obviously I Googled 1.67 meters tall. He was considered attractive. And if you're watching the video version of this, then I think you'll be able to see that for yourself. Not my particular type, but I can see how people would believe that he was. He was certainly not, displeasing to the eye. Now, interesting, his sister grew up to be a really well-respected police officer in Maine. So, thoughts on this case, right? To me, what stands out is that the bulk of his bullying began around 12 years old, when he was 12, when he came out as gay, and several people said that he did not make any attempts whatsoever to try to defend himself. Imagine the buildup of anger and rage. And yet his future victims were right around that age themselves. And stabbing multiple times, that's an intimate, close range way to murder someone, and it screams rage. Was he torturing and murdering himself in a sense? It is something to think about, isn't it? And that is our case for this week. I do hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you want more content from me, I have the second podcast, Serial Killing, Murder in the News. It's more humorous, but it's got murder, it's got serious things. We have some fun over there. So let me know in the comments what you think about this case. You can DM me on Instagram, serial_killing. You can join the Facebook group. We share murder stories and articles over there, memes, inappropriate humor, dark humor. If you can take it, come join us. The links to how to get a hold of me, all of that is in the notes. And outside of that, guys, thank you so much for listening, because I know that you could be listening to anyone else, right? But you guys just keep choosing me, and I really appreciate you guys so much. Thank you for your patience when things were getting a bit slow. I think I'm finally caught up on things now, so expect the regular output, I suppose. Have a great day. Bye.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer, and whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time. And then in the early 80s, they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.